Right, welcome to Mrs. Long's second video on approaches to essay structure, how to write a literature essay. Today we're going to be looking at how you approach your question and how to plan out your essay. In other words, the moment of truth. Okay, the first thing that happens when you sit down for an exam or you get given an assignment is that you need to read the question or questions. I say questions because often an examiner will give you a choice of two questions, and then not only do you have to decide which question you're going to answer, then you need to write the essay. And that brings up a whole other set of sort of questions. You need to look at both questions, weigh up which one you feel you could answer more effectively, and then make your decision based on the information you have available to you at that time. But we'll talk a little bit about more about that at a later stage. Obviously, the things you need to look at when you get the question is what actually is the question asking you to do. And quite often, there'll be more than one part of the question. So the first thing you need to do is, are there any words do you not understand? Now, if you have a choice of essay topics and there is a topic that has difficult words in, rather avoid it. You don't want to make a mistake and interpret the topic incorrectly. So have a look at the words that you don't understand and possibly try and figure out what they mean. I always tell my students they need to highlight or underline the key words in the question so that they can make sure that they're focusing on the correct things. And obviously, if the question does have more than one part, you need to make sure that you address both parts of the question. Let's look at an example. This is a very generalized question. It's based on the extract that we looked at earlier, or based on the novel that extract came from, which was Purple Hibiscus. This question says you need to discuss the journey of the main character Kambili and explain what her experiences show the reader. So what did I say we need to do? We need to pick out what the key words are. We need to ask ourselves what actually is the question asking us to do. Okay, so what is the question asking? Well, it wants us to look at the character and it wants us to explain her journey, the word journey is used, and then talk about why the character is important to the reader. Okay. Now, when you talk about a character's journey or a character's arc, obviously there's going to be some change. A character, in most books, when you first meet them, they're going to go through a series of experiences which will leave them changed from the person they were originally. The second part, essentially, if you're saying why is a character important, the teacher or the examiner usually wants you to tell us what the reader learns from the character. Okay, so we're looking at those two things. How Kambili changes, how she develops over her journey, and then what we can learn from her as the reader. The key words in that question would be journey, to show her changes, and then show, in other words, why she's important or what she teaches us. So are there two parts to this question? Yes, of course there are. And so now we need to make sure that in our answers, we make sure we cover both those parts. If you don't do that, the chances of getting a really good mark for your essay are very slim. Okay. Right, so now you know what your question is, and you know more or less what the question is asking you to do. And before you put pen to paper for the final copy of your essay, you need to plan it. I'm going to use another analogy here. You'll remember the hamburger analogy from the last video. This analogy is a road trip. Okay. If you do not plan your essay, in other words, if you do not say, I'm going to start here, go past these points and end there, it's just as bad as if you're saying, I'm going to go on a road trip, but you don't take a map. Okay. So in other words, your map is your plan. Okay. You need to brainstorm, say what your focus is going to be, and then make links between those topics. Okay, so you can see that those three things look like they're going down the road. That is the journey to the end of your essay. You need a map, and to get your plan or your map, you're going to brainstorm, decide on your focus, and make links between your different topics. And of course, failing to plan is like leaving on a road trip without making sure that you've got a full tank, or without making sure that you've got enough putt course to get you where you need to go, and not deciding where you're going to stay over if it's a really long trip and it could leave you stranded like this poor lady in the photo. If you don't plan out an essay, you might be stranded by the end of your exam and realize that you actually haven't answered the essay question, but you've already written 2 pages and you don't have time to go back and do it. So the argument is that planning takes time. Yes, of course it does, but you can't really afford the time if you don't plan, because then you will not have a complete, succinct essay. And the way that I like to tell my students to plan is to do a planning grid. The reason I say that is because it condenses all of the information you need in a plan to 1 page. So you can sit down in your exam in a pressurized environment, draw a few lines across your page, and then you know that you've got all the elements you need in a plan. And people often ask, why is the conclusion in the plan? Well, as I mentioned at the beginning of the first video, a literary essay has the answer in the introduction, and so it's not like you're waiting to get the answer at the end of your essay. You already know what your conclusion is going to be, so write it first, actually, because then you know whether or not you've reached that conclusion when you get there, and you know whether or not you've done what you needed to do to reach that conclusion. So I always tell my students to write their introduction and conclusion, and then brainstorm their points, and make sure that they link their point to an item of evidence, whether it be a quote or referring to something specific that happened. That also allows you to plan out how many paragraphs you're going to have, because you'll have 1 paragraph per point. So, for example, you'd have the topic of the paragraph there, and then you'd link it with the evidence or series of pieces of evidence that you want. Now, it's a plan, so you may not necessarily think of your points in the order in which they're going to appear in your essay. The nice thing about your planning grid is that you can just then put little stars or arrows, and you can decide maybe point 2 needs to go first, or maybe you're going to join point 2 and point 4 because they're quite similar. And as I mentioned earlier, that will give your essay focus so that you can decide on the best order for your ideas to be presented in to build your argument. So that's all for today's video. Really what I want you to take away from it is the questions you need to ask yourself in order to make sure that you know what the essay topic is requiring of you. And then always remember that taking the time to plan in the long run will save you time, because it'll take you less time to write the actual essay, because you're not going to be wondering what to say next. It's all going to be plotted out in your plan, and then you just need to take that plan and transfer it into the body of your essay.